Hello, and welcome back to the Starnet. As the title states, I am bored, so let's make a rocket engine. I joined Purdue Space Program's summer program, and we've been tasked to create a 100-pound thrust rocket engine using liquid fuels. So let's take our first steps towards space. So let's go through our options of fuel. First, we have hypergolic fuels, then we have liquid methane, liquid hydrogen, kerosene, isopropyl alcohol, and ethanol. So let's go through each of these fuels and decide which one's the best pick for us. Before we decide on which fuel we want to use, let's cover the basics of how a rocket engine works. A rocket engine works using Newton's third law of motion. Every action has an opposite equal reaction. So a rocket engine converts the high temperature and pressure of propellants burned in the combustion chamber into low pressure, low temperature exhaust. So it's using that high pressure and high temperature and sending that energy downwards, and that thus propels you the opposite direction, upwards. Hypergolic propellants are propellants that react immediately upon contact with each other. They can be stored for a long time in room temperature and are incredibly reliable, and thus are used in reaction control systems in a professional setting. However, they're incredibly expensive and incredibly volatile. In fact, they're very carcinogenic and can cause death if inhaled directly. Furthermore, they're difficult to cool and overall just a hassle to work with, so we're going to ignore them for this project, and as should you if you're making your own rocket engine. Liquid hydrogen and liquid methane are actually excellent fuels. They both use liquid oxygen as their oxidizer, and they have really high efficiency. In fact, they were even used for the space shuttle programs for those main RS-25 engines. However, for us, they're a little difficult to use. Since they're so cryogenic, with hydrogen at negative 423 Fahrenheit as a liquid, it's really high storage costs, and it's very difficult to work with in an engine. So for our amateur purposes, we're going to avoid these fuels. Now let's look at another propellant, kerosene. Kerosene is an excellent propellant, and it's the propellant that powered the Saturn V as it went to the moon. It also powers the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy today. Kerosene has a bunch of data on it since so many rockets have flown with it. However, it has one fundamental problem that prevents us from using it at this scale. Kerosene has a lot of soot in it, especially for us because we will be using non-rocketry grade kerosene. Thus, it's going to create a lot of smoke, which can cause clogging in our pipes. Next up, we have isopropyl alcohol. This fuel powered the Atlas rockets and the Mercury missions. In fact, it was the fuel that took the first American astronaut, John Glenn, to space. Even for our purposes, this is actually a pretty useful fuel. It's readily available in most stores at high concentration, and it burns a lot cleaner than kerosene. However, its best oxidizer is actually hydrogen peroxide, not liquid oxygen, and it's a little less efficient than our next fuel, so we're going to avoid isopropyl alcohol. Ethanol has many of the same properties as IPA. It's low cost, and it burns even cleaner than IPA, leaving behind little to no residue. Ethanol's main benefit to us is that it can be slightly diluted with water to lower chamber pressure. This allows our engine to not melt. For these reasons, ethanol is our fuel of choice for this project. Now, let's dive into about engine cooling and cycle types to wrap up. So how do rocket engines keep themselves from melting? So one method is called regenerative cooling. Regenerative cooling uses the rocket's own fuel to cool its combustion chamber. So right here, if you see, they would create the combustion chamber out of a bunch of small pipes and flow all that fuel through these pipes, and that would cool the chamber and prevent it from melting. Another method that industry uses to keep rocket engines from melting is called ablative cooling. So essentially what they do is apply some sort of carbon coating on the inside of the rocket engine and allow it to melt or flake off, taking the heat away with it. For example, in this engine, if I were to take this little strand, this would melt and contain a bunch of heat and then take it away. However, for our own simplicity, what we're going to do is called the heat sink method. This basically allows the rocket engine to just tank any heat it takes and absorb it. Now let's take a look at some rocket engine cycles. So in general, industrial rocket engines would use something called a preburner. This is basically a small rocket engine that powers the pumps that drive your fuel and oxidizer into your combustion chamber. This pump needs to be incredibly powerful. For example, let's take the Saturn V F1 engine. That engine pumped almost 1.5 tons of fuel per second through the engine. To get that much fuel through, you need some really powerful pumps. However, for our purposes, we're going to keep it more simple. What we're going to do is called pressure-fed engines. So this essentially puts a COPV inside the tanks. The COPV stands for carbon override pressure vessel. It's basically a tank full of high pressure gas we're going to open, and that's going to push all the fuel and oxidizer through the pipes and into our combustion chamber. Now that's going to be it for this first video of this series. However, I would just like to say it is not terribly safe to build a rocket engine at home, and that's not what I'm doing either. I'm going to be making my engine in the labs of Purdue under the supervision of many adults and mentors. If you do want to follow such a project, it's a good thing to think about how to design and make these choices, and you can do so with me. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. For now, let's just stellar it out.